Relations between Bulgaria and Russia have been growing stronger, raising concerns within the European Union. On December 11, 2024, Bulgarian President Rumen Radev met with Russian officials, signaling a potential shift in Bulgaria's foreign policy. This move challenges the EU's unified stance against Russian aggression, especially amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The EU has imposed numerous sanctions on Russia in an effort to curb its influence and support for the war. However, critics argue that the EU's approach has been inconsistent, with internal divisions weakening the effectiveness of its policies. Bulgaria's recent actions highlight this discord. The country has been granted exemptions from certain EU sanctions, allowing continued imports of Russian oil until March 2024. Additionally, the EU's reliance on member states to enforce sanctions has led to uneven implementation, with some countries prioritizing national interests over collective security concerns. This lack of cohesion has allowed Russia to exploit divisions within the EU, undermining the bloc's credibility on the global stage. The West's broader strategy towards Russia has also been criticized for being reactive rather than proactive. While sanctions serve as punitive measures, they have not effectively deterred Russian aggression or curtailed its geopolitical ambitions. The absence of a comprehensive long-term strategy has left the EU vulnerable to external pressures and internal dissent. Bulgaria's shift towards Russia cannot be viewed in isolation. It reflects deeper political instability and growing disillusionment within the country. Over the past 3 years, Bulgaria has held 7 parliamentary elections, a clear sign of its fractured political landscape. This cycle of instability has weakened the country's ability to pursue coherent policies both domestically and in its relations with the EU. A series of caretaker governments has exacerbated the crisis, functioning more as stopgaps than stable administrations capable of implementing long-term strategies. One major area where this instability is evident is Bulgaria's stalled efforts to meet the EU's economic and governance standards for Eurozone membership. The Eurozone, a cornerstone of EU integration, requires strict adherence to fiscal, legal, and institutional criteria. However, Bulgaria's caretaker administrations have struggled to address critical issues such as judiciary reform and combating corruption. This has created a widening gap between Bulgaria and the EU's core values, leaving the country on the periphery of EU decision-making processes. Such marginalization has fueled skepticism toward Brussels and opened the door to alternative alliances, including closer ties with Russia. This alignment with Moscow serves as a direct challenge to the EU's broader strategy of countering Russian influence in Eastern Europe. For years, the EU has invested heavily in strengthening democratic institutions and promoting transparency in former Eastern Bloc countries. Yet Bulgaria's pivot toward Russia suggests that these efforts have been insufficient. The Bulgarian government has increasingly resisted EU policies, particularly those aimed at isolating Russia economically and diplomatically. Sofia's continued reliance on Russian energy resources, despite EU sanctions and efforts to diversify, underscores the fragility of the EU's influence in the region. At the heart of this shift is Bulgaria's failure to embrace key EU norms, especially in areas like the rule of law and anti-corruption measures. The EU has long criticized Bulgaria for its opaque judicial system and entrenched corruption, issues that successive governments have failed to address meaningfully. This failure not only erodes public trust in Bulgarian institutions, but also weakens the country's integration into the EU framework. Without tangible progress in these areas, Bulgaria's commitment to the EU appears increasingly tenuous, raising questions about its willingness to uphold shared European values. Russia has taken advantage of these vulnerabilities by presenting itself as an alternative to what many Bulgarians see as an overly bureaucratic and disconnected EU. Moscow has cultivated goodwill among certain segments of the Bulgarian population, with historical and cultural ties between the two nations further strengthening this relationship. The Kremlin portrays itself as a reliable partner that respects Bulgaria's sovereignty, in contrast to the EU's perceived heavy-handedness. This messaging resonates particularly in rural areas and among older generations, who often view the EU's reform demands as intrusive and out of touch with their daily lives. The EU's response to these developments has been inconsistent, mirroring its broader struggles to maintain cohesion among member states. While Brussels has imposed sanctions on Russia and sought to reduce energy dependence, it has not adequately addressed the internal divisions that undermine its unity. The EU's focus on punitive measures against Russia has often overshadowed the need to strengthen its own institutions and support vulnerable member states like Bulgaria. This oversight has allowed Russia to gain a foothold in the region, challenging the EU's ability to project power and maintain stability on its eastern flank. Bulgaria's drift toward Russia is emblematic of a larger crisis facing the EU: the inability to reconcile the diverse needs and priorities of its member states. Without addressing the root causes of political instability and economic stagnation in countries like Bulgaria, the EU risks losing its influence in Eastern Europe. This not only weakens the position of the EU vis-à-vis Russia, but also undermines its credibility as a proponent of democratic governance and the rule of law. The stakes are high, and the EU must act decisively to reaffirm its commitment to all its members, or risk further fragmentation in the face of growing external threats. Economic relations between Bulgaria and Russia, once a cornerstone of Bulgaria's foreign trade and energy strategy, are undergoing significant transformation. Historically, Bulgaria depended heavily on Russian energy, particularly natural gas and nuclear fuel for its Kozloduy nuclear power plant. This dependency made Bulgaria vulnerable to geopolitical tensions, a reality that became glaringly evident after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the EU's subsequent sanctions regime. While Bulgaria has been slower than some other EU nations to sever economic ties with Russia, there are signs that this relationship is waning. In a bold move, the Bulgarian parliament recently revoked key agreements with Russian energy companies, signaling a shift toward greater energy independence. Among the most notable decisions was the termination of agreements related to the Belene nuclear power plant, a long-delayed project that had been tied to Russian expertise and financing. This decision reflects Bulgaria's growing recognition of the risks associated with reliance on Moscow. However, the transition to alternative energy sources has not been without its challenges. Infrastructure limitations, combined with the lack of a coherent national energy strategy, have slowed progress, leaving Bulgaria in a precarious position during its energy transition. The EU has strongly encouraged member states to diversify their energy supplies, offering financial incentives and technical support to reduce dependence on Russian energy. While Bulgaria has taken steps to align with these goals, such as increasing natural gas imports from Azerbaijan and exploring liquefied natural gas (LNG) options via Greece, the pace of change remains slow. Domestic political instability has further complicated these challenges, delaying critical investments in renewable energy and The European Union and Western powers have often been praised for their commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and economic development. However, their approach to Bulgaria highlights critical flaws in these strategies, particularly when addressing the needs of smaller, less stable member states. Critics argue that the EU has failed to provide sufficient support to stabilize Bulgaria's fragile political landscape, a fundamental requirement for deeper integration into the bloc's core institutions, such as the Eurozone and the Schengen area. While Bulgaria has made incremental progress, the EU's approach has often been perceived as punitive rather than constructive, fostering resentment among both Bulgarian citizens and leaders. The EU's policy of conditionality, which requires member states to meet strict benchmarks in areas such as governance, anti-corruption efforts, and judicial reform, is frequently seen in Bulgaria as a form of interference. While these conditions aim to ensure adherence to EU norms, they often fail to account for the structural and historical challenges faced by nations like Bulgaria. For example, despite meeting many technical criteria for Schengen membership, Bulgaria remains excluded, primarily due to concerns over corruption and border security. This exclusion has led to widespread frustration, with many Bulgarians viewing the EU as prioritizing political optics over substantive support. This dynamic is further exacerbated by the perception that the EU devotes disproportionate attention and resources to its larger, more influential member states. Bulgaria, like many smaller nations, often finds itself marginalized in EU decision-making processes. This sense of neglect is particularly pronounced when it comes to addressing regional security concerns. The EU's focus on imposing sanctions against Russia, while important, has not adequately addressed the specific security challenges faced by Eastern European nations. Bulgaria, situated on the geopolitical fault line between Europe and Russia, requires tailored support to bolster its defense capabilities and safeguard its sovereignty. However, the EU's efforts in this area have been inconsistent and underwhelming. The inadequacy of EU support is not limited to military and security issues. Economically, Bulgaria has struggled to bridge the gap between itself and the EU's wealthier member states. While EU structural funds have provided some assistance to Bulgaria, they are often burdened with complex bureaucratic requirements that delay implementation and limit their effectiveness. These funds fail to tackle the root causes of Bulgaria's economic stagnation, such as systemic corruption and an underdeveloped industrial base. Without significant investment in these areas, Bulgaria's integration into the Eurozone and broader EU framework will remain a distant goal. This lack of meaningful engagement has allowed Russia to reassert its influence. Faced with what many perceive as EU indifference, Bulgaria has increasingly looked to Moscow for security and economic guarantees. This shift is not just driven by historical ties or cultural affinities. It is a pragmatic response to the EU's failure to address Bulgaria's immediate concerns. Russia has seized this opportunity by offering energy deals and military cooperation, which appeal to Bulgarian leaders seeking alternatives to the EU's approach. While these offers come with their own risks, they reflect broader dissatisfaction with the EU's treatment of its eastern neighbors. The West's response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine further highlights these shortcomings. Sanctions and military aid have had some success, but have failed to reassure smaller countries like Bulgaria, which feel that their unique security needs are not being taken seriously. The EU's reliance on NATO to handle regional security has created gaps in its policy, leaving smaller states feeling isolated. For Bulgaria, this has reinforced the perception that the EU is more focused on maintaining its image as a unified bloc than addressing the real challenges faced by its more vulnerable members. The broader Western strategy toward Eastern Europe also needs to be re-evaluated. By focusing primarily on punitive measures against Russia, the West has neglected the need to strengthen cohesion within its own alliances. Efforts to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation have been poorly coordinated, leaving countries like Bulgaria vulnerable to narratives that undermine trust in EU institutions. Additionally, Western policies often fail to account for the economic ties between Eastern European countries and Russia, making sanctions difficult to implement without risking significant domestic backlash. Ultimately, the EU and the West must reconsider their approach to Bulgaria and similar nations. Instead of imposing conditions perceived as punitive, the focus should be on building capacity and fostering genuine partnerships. This involves not only financial support, but also technical expertise and political backing to help Bulgaria address its internal challenges. It also calls for a more nuanced regional security strategy, one that recognizes the unique vulnerabilities of Eastern European countries and offers concrete solutions, not just vague assurances. Without such changes, the EU risks alienating its eastern members and undermining the very unity it seeks to preserve. Bulgaria's current trajectory has far-reaching implications, not just for the country but for the EU and broader geopolitical stability. If Bulgaria continues to gravitate closer to Russia, it risks becoming a significant foothold for Russian influence within the EU, potentially undermining the bloc's unity. This would give Moscow strategic leverage, enabling it to influence EU decision-making from within, complicating the EU's response to Russian aggression. Bulgaria's geographical position as a gateway between Europe and the Black Sea region only amplifies these concerns. One of the immediate risks is the rise of populist movements in Bulgaria that advocate for closer ties with Russia. These movements often exploit dissatisfaction with EU policies, portraying Brussels as an out-of-touch bureaucracy that prioritizes Western Europe over its eastern members. Populist rhetoric has gained traction in recent years, fueled by economic stagnation, political instability, and lingering cultural ties with Russia. If these forces gain more political power, they could further destabilize the region, making it harder for the EU to present a united front against external threats. The implications extend beyond Bulgaria's borders. A stronger Russian presence in Bulgaria could encourage other Eastern European nations, such as Hungary and Serbia, to reassess their relationships with both Moscow and Brussels. These countries, already grappling with similar challenges, may see Bulgaria's pivot as validation of their own strategies, further eroding the EU's influence in the region. This potential domino effect underscores the urgency of addressing the root causes of Bulgaria's drift before it becomes a larger problem for the entire EU. To counteract these trends, the EU must reassess its approach to Eastern European nations like Bulgaria. The current reliance on conditionality and punitive measures has proven insufficient, often exacerbating local frustrations rather than resolving underlying issues. A more nuanced strategy is needed, one that combines constructive engagement with targeted reforms. For instance, the EU could increase investments in Bulgaria's infrastructure and economic development, providing tangible benefits that demonstrate the value of EU membership. Simultaneously, these efforts should address systemic corruption and governance issues to ensure EU funds are used effectively and transparently. In addition to economic support, the EU must prioritize regional security in its dealings with Bulgaria. This means moving beyond general sanctions on Russia and offering specific, localized solutions to address Bulgaria's security vulnerabilities. Enhanced military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and cybersecurity initiatives could reassure Bulgaria of the EU's commitment to its security. Such measures would not only strengthen Bulgaria's defenses, but also send a clear message to Moscow that the EU stands firm in its support for its eastern members. The EU must also do more to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation, which play a significant role in shaping public opinion in Bulgaria. Media literacy programs, support for independent journalism, and partnerships with local civil society organizations could help combat false narratives that erode trust in EU institutions. These efforts should be part of a broader campaign to promote democratic values and foster a stronger sense of European identity, countering populist movements that seek closer ties with Russia. The stakes are high. If the EU fails to act, Bulgaria may drift further into Moscow's orbit, a development that would have far-reaching consequences for the EU's stability and cohesion. However, if the EU adapts its strategies to better address the needs of countries like Bulgaria, it has the potential to reverse these trends and strengthen its global leadership. A more inclusive and responsive EU, one that values all its members regardless of size or economic power, will be better positioned to face the challenges of the 21st century and uphold the vision of a united democratic Europe. Bulgaria's future is a test case for the EU's ability to balance ideals with pragmatic action. Whether the EU rises to the challenge or falters under internal divisions will determine not only Bulgaria's trajectory, but also the EU's role on the global stage. The time for strategic reassessment is now. The cost of inaction may be higher than Europe can afford.